In the winter dawn of 502 CE, when frost clung to the marble statues outside Constantinople's hippodrome, a young girl named Theodora walked barefoot across the cold stones of the city. No one watching her that morning could imagine that this child, born to one of the lowest professions of Byzantine society, would one day rise to become the most powerful woman in the history of the empire, shaping laws, crushing revolts, and redefining imperial authority itself. Her future was unwritten, but the world she stepped into was already preparing her for the fight of her life. The Byzantine Empire at the start of the 6th century was a world of contradictions. It was Christian in faith but Roman in structure, luxurious in culture yet brutal in politics, and for all its sophistication, it treated women, performers, and laborers with disdain. Social mobility was nearly impossible. A girl born into the wrong class could expect a lifetime of hardship, invisibility, or exploitation. This was the Constantinople of Theodora's childhood, a city that glittered on its surface yet hid a ruthless hierarchy beneath. Theodora's father, Acacius, worked as a bear keeper for the Green faction in the Hippodrome. These factions, Greens and Blues, were far more than racing teams. They were political machines, social networks, and at times violent organizations that shaped the city's mood. When Acacius died unexpectedly, the family's protection vanished. Her mother, desperate to secure support, marched Theodora and her 2 sisters into the Hippodrome, begging the Greens to take them in. When the Greens refused, the Blues offered help instead, unknowingly giving sanctuary to a girl who would later determine the fate of their faction and the empire. By the time Theodora turned 12, her family's dire poverty forced her into the world of theatre. Yet the Byzantine theatre was not a place of artistic respect. Performers, especially female mimes and dancers, were considered the lowest rung of society. They were subject to public humiliation, coercion, and exploitation. It was here, in an environment shaped by predatory expectations and the darkest corners of Byzantine entertainment culture, that Theodora's resilience was forged. But Theodora was not a victim of circumstance. Even as a child, she possessed a sharp intelligence, a commanding presence, and a remarkable understanding of human nature. These would one day make her the partner of an emperor. In the early 6th century, Constantinople's entertainment world blended pantomime, political satire, and outrageous public acts. Many public performances involved shock value and sensationalism, designed to draw crowds and stir emotions. While moralists of the time wrote sensational accounts describing backstage behavior in exaggerated and scandalized terms, their writings reflected more about elite prejudice than documented fact. Still, the environment was harsh and exploitative. Women in entertainment were denied social dignity, treated as public property, and given little recourse against the powerful men who dominated the Hippodrome's economy. Theodora learned to survive within this brutal framework. She learned how the crowds thought, how politics worked behind the scenes, how power flowed through relationships, and how influence could be gained not only through performance, but through understanding the desires and fears of those in control. She observed people, memorized their habits, and perfected the art of reading rooms filled with senators, aristocrats, and wealthy patrons. As she entered her teenage years, Theodora began performing comedic sketches, mime plays, dances, and public routines that often mocked the elite. Her charisma was undeniable. Crowds roared when she appeared. She learned how to make them laugh, how to provoke emotion, how to stand in front of thousands and command attention without trembling. But behind every cheer, every roar of approval, she understood a deeper truth. The same society that loved watching her perform would never accept her as a respectable woman. In Byzantine law, performers were barred from marrying into high society, barred from holding property with autonomy, and barred from lifting themselves above their assigned rank. Theodora knew the world had placed her in a cage, but she refused to remain inside it. In her late teens, a dramatic turning point arrived. A powerful official named Hesibulus took her as his companion and brought her across the Mediterranean to North Africa. For a while, it seemed she had escaped the brutal world of Constantinople's theatre. But life with Hesibulus soon became another trap. Their relationship deteriorated, and Theodora found herself abandoned, humiliated, and stranded far from home. It was during this period of exile that Theodora discovered something extraordinary within herself: the courage to confront powerful men, the determination to reclaim her life, and a newfound spiritual clarity. According to later accounts, she embraced a more disciplined, reflective lifestyle, shedding the instability of her earlier years. She returned to Constantinople not as a broken performer, but as a hardened survivor with an unshakable sense of purpose. When she finally made it back to the capital, Theodora supported herself through skilled wools, spinning near the city's forum. She lived modestly, avoiding the theatre world that had once defined her, and presented herself as a respectable, reformed woman, something almost unheard of for a former entertainer. But Theodora was more than respectable. She had transformed, and Constantinople was about to notice. Around this time, a young man often walked near the forum: Justinian, the brilliant nephew of Emperor Justinian. Unlike other aristocrats, Justinian had risen from humble origins, giving him a far more open mind than his peers. When he first saw Theodora, intelligent, composed, self-possessed, and unlike any woman he had ever met, he was captivated. Their conversations revealed a startling truth. Theodora was not merely charming, she was exceptionally educated in human behavior, politics, and philosophy of survival. Her insights impressed Justinian, who valued intelligence as highly as loyalty. A connection formed that transcended class, image, and reputation. But Byzantine law stood in their way. A man of Justinian's rank could not marry a woman with a background in theatre. The Senate opposed it, the Church hesitated, the elite recoiled. Yet Justinian was stubborn, and Theodora was unyielding. Together, they did something unheard of in Byzantine history. They changed the law itself. In **525 C**, Justin I passed legislation allowing reformed performers to marry outside their class. It was a groundbreaking legal shift clearly crafted for one purpose: to legalize the union of Justinian and Theodora. When they married soon after, Constantinople erupted with shock. A woman who had once stood on a public stage as a performer now stood beside the heir to the empire. What few realized was that this marriage did not elevate Theodora. It revealed her. From this moment forward, Theodora began her journey to becoming the most influential woman the empire had ever known. Her past hardships, humiliations, and battles for dignity had forged a leader of astonishing strength. The stage, however, was only being set. Her true test would come when the empire itself began to burn, and only she had the courage to save it. On the cold morning of April 1, 527 C, Constantinople held its breath. The bells of Hagia Sophia echoed through the city as Justinian's coronation procession moved toward the great palace. Silk banners fluttered in the wind. Soldiers in polished armor lined the streets. Citizens packed every corner of the Augustine Square to witness an event that none of their ancestors could have imagined: the rise of a former performer, a woman once dismissed as the lowest of the low, ascending as the imperial Augusta. As the golden crown was lowered onto Theodora's head, the Byzantine elite stared in disbelief. This was not just a coronation, it was a revelation. A woman who had endured the harshest realities of Constantinople's entertainment world now stood above senators, generals, bishops, and aristocrats. Theodora was no longer the girl shaped by the city's dark underbelly. She had become its empress, and the empire she now ruled beside Justinian was on the edge of chaos. The 6th century Byzantine world was a storm of internal rivalries, economic tensions, and deep divisions between the blues and the greens, the factions that dominated Constantinople's political and social life. These factions had grown far beyond chariot racing teams. They were now sprawling networks of patronage, loyalty, and street power. Their rivalries often erupted into violence, riots, and assassinations. Theodora understood these factions better than anyone. She had grown up inside their world, had seen how leaders manipulated crowds, and knew how quickly a single spark could turn the hippodrome into a battlefield. But even she could not predict what would happen in 532 CE. That year, an explosive chain of events, brutal taxation, political frustration, and factional anger, ignited the most violent uprising in the city's history. It would be known as the Nika Revolt, a week-long catastrophe that nearly ended Justinian's rule and destroyed half of Constantinople. And at its darkest moment, it would be Theodora, not the emperor, not the generals, who saved the empire. The revolt began with the execution of 2 men associated with the Greens and Blues. When the crowd gathered in the hippodrome to protest, their anger quickly escalated. Chants of Ni, meaning conquer or victory, filled the stadium. The factions, usually bitter enemies, united against the imperial government. Their rage spilled into the streets within hours. Fires erupted. Palaces, churches, and public buildings were swallowed by flames. By the second day, rioters had burned the city center. By the third, they controlled nearly every major district. Inside the great palace, panic spread. Justinian feared for his life. His advisors pressed him to flee by ship across the Bosporus. Generals debated strategies. Senators secretly plotted to replace him. Theodora watched them all, calm, silent, calculating. When the council finally gathered to decide whether the emperor should escape, Justinian's resolve broke. He prepared to abandon his throne and flee the city. His men nodded, believing escape was the only rational choice. Then Theodora stood up. Her voice was steady, sharp, and filled with a force that silenced every man in the chamber. She began with a simple truth. Rulers could recover from defeat, but no emperor who fled his capital ever returned to rule. She delivered a speech that would be remembered forever. There are times when flight is impossible. Anyone who has worn the crown must never survive the loss of royal dignity. I accept that death is a natural part of life, but I will never accept living without honor. If you wish to go, Emperor, there is nothing stopping you, but I will remain. The royal purple is the noblest shroud. No one had expected such words. Theodora, once dismissed by the elite, had just declared what no general or senator dared to, that the empire was worth dying for, and fleeing would destroy everything they had built. Her speech transformed the atmosphere instantly. Justinian straightened. His generals stood at attention. The fear in the room evaporated, replaced by grim determination. Theodora had not only saved the emperor's courage, she had saved the entire regime. With renewed resolve, Justinian ordered his best generals, Belisarius and Mundus, to prepare a decisive strike. Using information from faction insiders, they trapped tens of thousands of rioters inside the hippodrome. What followed was brutal, swift, and final. The revolt collapsed. The leaders were executed. Order returned to the city. Theodora's intervention had changed history. Without her defiance, Justinian would have fled, the empire would have splintered, and Byzantium's golden age would have never begun. Her courage proved she was not merely an empress by title. She was a leader with the heart of a general and the mind of a strategist. In the months that followed the revolt, Justinian rebuilt Constantinople with breathtaking ambition. New churches rose from the ashes, none more magnificent than Hagia Sophia, the greatest cathedral of the medieval world. Senators who had conspired against the emperor were quietly removed. Faction power was curtailed. The empire emerged stronger, but it was Theodora who ensured that such strength had survived the crisis. Her role in state affairs expanded dramatically. She attended meetings of the Imperial Council. She shaped legal reforms, especially those involving women, children, and marginalized groups. Her early life had taught her firsthand the dangers of exploitation and injustice, and she pushed for laws that protected women from forced prostitution, expanded rights for the vulnerable, and punished abuses of power. Yet the higher she rose, the more enemies she made. Aristocrats whispered that her past made her unworthy of the throne. Bishops resented her influence. Foreign envoys were stunned to see a woman participate so boldly in matters of empire. But Theodora was unmoved. She had survived poverty, exile, humiliation, and the prejudices of a society that never believed she belonged. The palace's political machinery was nothing compared to the brutality of her early life, and she wielded her authority with decisive confidence. Theodora's growing influence also extended to foreign policy, theological debates, and imperial succession. She was not merely a wife or symbolic partner. She was a co-ruler, a force who shaped Justinian's reign from its foundations. But ahead awaited her greatest political battles: rival empires, religious conflicts, and internal plot. Struggles that would test her resolve, challenge her values, and solidify her legacy as the most powerful empress in Byzantine history. Her past had shaped her. The Nika Revolt had revealed her. Now the world would witness the height of her power. By the early 530s CE, the Byzantine Empire no longer viewed Theodora as merely Justinian's wife. She had become a central pillar of imperial power. Foreign ambassadors reported back to their courts that the empire now had two rulers instead of one. Church leaders found themselves debating with a woman whose intellect rivaled their own. Generals realized that imperial decisions required not only the emperor's approval, but Theodora's insight as well. No empress before her had wielded such influence, and none would ever shape the Byzantine state in the same transformative way. Yet behind the marble walls of the great palace, power was never secure. Every step Theodora took was shadowed by threats, political rivals, jealous nobles, foreign pressures, and internal divisions that could erupt at any moment. What made her rise extraordinary was not simply her authority, but how she wielded it despite the hostility of a political world dominated entirely by men. One of her greatest battlegrounds became the Church, which was fractured by a fierce theological conflict. The empire was torn between different Christian doctrines: Orthodox Chalcedonians and the Monophysites, whose beliefs differed on the nature of Christ. These disputes were not abstract debates. They shaped alliances, rebellions, and imperial legitimacy itself. Justinian supported Orthodox Christianity. Theodora, however, sympathized deeply with the Monophysites, a persecuted minority across the empire. Her reasons, while rooted in spirituality, were also political. She understood the pain of living on the margins, being judged by origin rather than merit, and she saw in persecuted believers a reflection of her own early struggles. While Justinian enforced orthodox doctrine through imperial law, Theodora quietly worked behind the scenes to shelter Monophysite clergy, offer them refuge, and influence theological negotiations. She transformed parts of the palace into safe havens where hunted bishops could hide from arrest. Foreign rulers later wrote that Theodora's protection saved entire religious communities from destruction. But her support was more than compassion. It was strategic. By championing the Monophysite cause, she gained loyalty from communities in Egypt, Syria, and Armenia, regions vital to the empire's stability. These alliances would serve her well during future political storms. Another stage on which Theodora's influence soared was legal reform, where she shaped some of the empire's most humane and progressive laws. Justinian's legal codification, known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, is considered one of the greatest achievements in legal history, and Theodora's handprints are visible throughout its social reforms. She pushed for laws that protected women from forced prostitution, exploitation, and abuse, conditions she had personally experienced in her youth. She supported legislation granting women more rights to property, inheritance, and legal representation. Her reforms expanded protections for divorced women and mothers, and even allowed some formerly marginalized groups to regain social dignity. For a society that saw women as legally dependent on men, her influence was revolutionary. Senators protested it, aristocrats despised it, Theodora didn't care. Her early life had trained her to recognize injustice on sight. Now she had the power to change it. Yet reforms were only one side of Theodora's political character. She was compassionate to those crushed by the system, but ruthless against those who threatened the empire. Her strength made her both admired and feared. The most dramatic example of her ruthless resolve came during one of the deadliest rivalries within the palace, her conflict with Belisarius's powerful wife, Antonina. Antonina was Theodora's closest ally, but also her most dangerous counterpart. Both women rose from low social origins, both wielded influence through intelligence and charm, and both navigated imperial politics with unmatched skill. They understood each other profoundly, and for that reason they were also severe rivals. When a scandal erupted involving Antonina's son, Theodora intervened decisively, protecting Antonina despite widespread criticism. She imprisoned one of Antonina's enemies in a monastery and personally oversaw negotiations to control the fallout. Theodora's willingness to shape palace politics with an iron fist ensured that she, not the generals, not the Senate, held the true balance of power. Even outsider observers were stunned. Procopius, the historian who despised her, wrote malicious and exaggerated accusations in his secret history, portraying her as domineering and dangerous. Though biased and riddled with spite, his writings inadvertently confirm one fact: Theodora's authority was unmatched. While she defended her allies, Theodora was equally merciless with her enemies. One incident revealed the depth of her resolve. In the late 530s, a coup plot was uncovered involving high-ranking officials who sought to replace Justinian during a period of illness. The conspirators believed the emperor was dying, and that the throne would soon be vulnerable. Theodora, however, acted before the plot gained momentum. She ordered swift arrests, interrogations, and trials. Several were executed, others were exiled or stripped of their positions. Historians later noted that the empire survived that crisis because of her decisive intervention. Outside the palace walls, however, Theodora's strategic mind was shaping Byzantium's position in the wider world. The empire faced constant threats from the Persians, Slavs, and Ostrogoths. Justinian's dream was to restore the old Roman territories in the West Italy, North Africa, and Spain, and Belisarius was leading vast campaigns to reclaim them. But war was expensive. The empire's treasury strained under the cost. Diplomacy became essential, and Theodora excelled at it. She brokered secret deals, negotiated with foreign envoys, and used alliances with religious minorities to strengthen Byzantine influence abroad. In correspondence with rulers such as the Persian queen and various Eastern bishops, she maneuvered Byzantium out of dangerous confrontations that could have torn the empire apart. Many of these diplomatic exchanges were conducted privately, through letters and personal envoys who reported directly to her. Behind the scenes, she was as pivotal to Byzantine strategy as any general on the battlefield. Yet the greatest challenge of Theodora's later years came not from politics or war, but from illness. Around 548 CE, she began suffering from what many historians believe was breast cancer. Despite her weakening condition, she continued to attend council meetings, advocate for her reforms, and influence court decisions. Her intellect remained sharp even as her body weakened. She refused to allow illness to diminish her authority. She had clawed her way through poverty, humiliation, and the darkest corners of Byzantine society. She had survived the Nika Revolt, reshaped imperial law, protected religious minorities, and held the empire together during crises. Illness would not break her spirit. Her final months were spent in the palace where she had once walked as a young woman returning from exile, uncertain of her future. Now she walked those same halls as the most powerful woman of her age. Her final decisions were guided by a single purpose: to secure the empire's stability and ensure Justinian's reforms would endure beyond her life. On June 28, 548, Theodora died at the age of approximately 48. Justinian wept openly, unable to conceal his grief. The empire mourned the loss of a woman who had risen from the margins to reshape its destiny. Her funeral procession stretched across Constantinople, with nobles, clergy, soldiers, and common citizens walking behind her bier. For the first time in Byzantine history, people spoke openly of an empress not as a ceremonial figure, but as a leader, a lawmaker, and a savior of the empire. But Theodora's legacy would not end with her death. Her influence would echo across the Mediterranean world, through law, diplomacy, religion, politics, and the enduring story of how a woman born into the harshest environment became one of the most powerful figures of the medieval world. The final chapter of her story would reveal how her legacy shaped empires and inspired generations long after her passing. When Theodora died in 548 CE, the Byzantine Empire felt the loss like a crack through its imperial foundation. For more than 2 decades, she had been the backbone of Justinian's rule, the voice of resolve in moments of panic, and the architect behind many of the empire's most humane reforms. But her story did not end with her death. In many ways, her influence only grew stronger as the consequences of her life's work unfolded across the empire and echoed through centuries of history. To understand Theodora's legacy, one must return to the world she came from, a rigidly stratified society where a woman of low birth had no chance of rising to power. In the 6th century, status was determined not by talent or intelligence, but by birth and wealth. Performers, dancers, mimes, and entertainers were considered among the lowest classes. Laws restricted their movement, judged their morality, and confined their opportunities. And yet this same society elevated Theodora to the highest rank of all, Augusta co-ruler of an empire spanning continents. Her rise was so extraordinary that even her enemies, chroniclers who despised her background or resented her authority, were forced to acknowledge its magnitude. They could criticize her past, exaggerate scandals, or attack her character, but they could not deny her impact. Her legacy can be understood across 5 powerful dimensions: her political influence, her legal reforms, her religious role, her cultural memory, and her symbolic power for later generations. The first dimension of her legacy is political. During her lifetime, Theodora was a political force, a strategist unmatched in the palace, and the only person capable of counterbalancing Justinian's immense ambition with practical wisdom. Her presence at court created a new precedent for imperial power. No empress before her had been given such a commanding voice in state affairs. After her death, Justinian continued to govern with a more hardened, decisive style, one shaped by her example. Many historians agree that Theodora's leadership during the Nika Revolt fundamentally reshaped Justinian's confidence and political philosophy. Without her boldness that day, Justinian's entire reign would have collapsed. Byzantium's golden age, its architectural achievements, its legal codes, its reclaimed territories, would never have existed. Later emperors and empresses studied her role, even if they never publicly admitted it. Her political partnership with Justinian became the model for imperial marriages, in which the empress was not merely a ceremonial figure, but a significant advisor. A century later, the powerful Empress Irene would rule the empire directly, and though separated by time and circumstance, Irene's rise echoed the breakthrough Theodora had made possible. The second dimension is her legal legacy, which is profound and measurable. The reforms she influenced were incorporated into Justinian's codified laws and endured for centuries. These laws, compiled into the Corpus Juris Civilis, became the foundation of legal systems across Europe and influenced modern law codes in multiple nations. Among the areas shaped by Theodora's advocacy were protections for women against exploitation, rights for enslaved or trafficked individuals to seek justice, the ability of women to own property and inherit wealth, legal safeguards for divorced or widowed women, measures to punish men who abused their authority over vulnerable women. These reforms were revolutionary in her time. They challenged the deeply held prejudices of Byzantine society and elevated the status of women in ways unseen before. Even centuries later, scholars studying the empire's legal system noted the unusual sensitivity of certain laws toward the dignity and autonomy of women. Many of these changes can be traced to Theodora's direct influence. The third dimension of her legacy lies in religion. Theodora's support for monophys communities shaped the empire's religious landscape for decades after her death. By protecting persecuted clergy, providing safe havens, and facilitating dialogue between rival theological camps, she prevented violent rifts that could have torn the empire apart. Her palatial refuges for monophys priests continued to operate after her death, quietly influencing religious relations across the eastern provinces. Even when Justinian enforced strict Orthodox doctrine in later decrees, Theodora's earlier efforts softened the impact and preserved the survival of minority Christian communities. In regions like Egypt, Syria, and Armenia, Theodora became a celebrated figure among believers who felt abandoned by the state. Church leaders wrote letters praising her compassion and calling her a protector of the faithful. Her name appears in religious histories not as an emperor's wife, but as a guardian of refuges and spiritual integrity. The fourth dimension of her legacy is cultural memory. No Byzantine empress generated more debate, discussion, admiration, and fear in historical writings than Theodora. She became a figure larger than life, inspiring both devotion and hostility. Even her harshest critic, Procopius, inadvertently ensured her immortality by writing extensively about her, first in his official histories, then in his infamous secret history. Though the secret history contains exaggerated and hostile portrayals, it reflects one undeniable truth. Theodora's impact was so monumental that her enemies felt compelled to distort her image in order to resist her influence. Such writings have shaped modern debates about her personality, but contemporary scholars now recognize the complexity of her character and the remarkable achievements she accomplished. Art from later centuries depicts Theodora with a halo, symbolizing her power and wisdom. The famous mosaics in Ravenna's Basilica of San Vitel show her standing regally beside Justinian, holding a golden chalice, surrounded by attendants. Her robes gleam with jewels, her crown symbolizes imperial authority, and her expression is calm, confident, and immovable. The mosaic is important not because it flatters her, but because it confirms her status. She appears not behind the emperor, but beside him, equal in presence and stature. The fifth dimension of her legacy is symbolic, and perhaps the most powerful of all. Theodora's life story became a testimony to the possibility of transformation. She rose from the most marginalized corner of Byzantine society to the very heart of imperial power. She broke legal, social, and cultural barriers that had existed for centuries. Her journey from a childhood of struggle to the throne of Constantinople stands as one of the most dramatic social ascents recorded in ancient or medieval history. For millions today, her story represents resilience, determination, and the ability to defy the world's expectations. She has become an icon for historians, feminists, writers, and artists. Her life demonstrates that greatness can emerge from the darkest environments, not despite them, but because they forge strength, clarity, and unbreakable will. Her ability to navigate danger, survive humiliation, understand human ambition, and outmaneuver powerful enemies transformed her into a leader unmatched in her era. She proved that a woman's authority could shape the destiny of an empire, and that her insight could influence military decisions, religious policies, and legal systems for generations. After her death, Justinian continued to rule for nearly 2 decades, but those who observed him closely noted that he was never the same. Without Theodora's counsel, his policies became more rigid, his decisions less balanced. The empire suffered from the absence of the woman who had steadied its course. When Justinian died in **, 565 C***, nearly 17 years after Theodora, he was buried in a mausoleum where their names were remembered together. Even in death, they remained a pair, an emperor remembered for his ambition and an empress remembered for her extraordinary rise and unmatched legacy. Together, they shaped one of the most remarkable periods in Byzantine history. But Theodora's personal journey stands apart, not because she was an empress, but because she was a survivor who used every hardship as a stepping stone toward unimaginable power. Her life remains a testament to the human capacity for reinvention, and the truth that historical greatness often emerges from those the world least expects.